The farm had always been there, an ancient sprawl of tilled earth and sagging barns that seemed to breathe under the weight of its history. Locals called it Hollowfield, though no one could remember why. It stood on the edge of town, where the woods crept too close and shadows lingered long after the sun dipped below the horizon. For as long as anyone could remember, the land was owned by the Drexler family, a lineage that had lived there for generations, always keeping to themselves. It began with whispers, the kind that travel like smoke in small towns. "The animals don't sound right over there," someone would say. "Heard a cow scream like a man last week," another would mutter, glancing nervously toward the fields. At first, it was easy to dismiss. Every farm had its strange noises, the restless shuffle of hooves, the shrill cries of barn cats fighting in the dark. But Hollowfield was different. Caleb, the youngest Drexler, was the only member of the family people occasionally saw in town. Tall and wiry, with a hollowed-out look in his eyes, he rarely spoke unless absolutely necessary. He came in once a week, buying feed, salt licks, and odd tools no one else seemed to need. People tried to pry, but Caleb's face gave away nothing. One evening, as a blood-red sun sank behind the gnarled trees, a boy named Henry dared his friends to sneak onto Hollowfield. They were teenagers, drunk on cheap whiskey and the invincibility of youth. No one said no, though their laughter was forced as they crossed the fence line and crept toward the barns. The air felt wrong the moment they set foot on the property. It was heavy, thick with a smell that wasn't quite manure, not quite rot. The barn loomed ahead, its wood warped and blackened, as though it had soaked in centuries of rain. The boys pushed open the door, the hinges groaning like a dying animal. Inside, the stench hit them first, an acrid cocktail of copper and decay. Hanging from the rafters were carcasses of animals, but not the kind they were expecting. Pigs with too many legs, chickens whose necks twisted impossibly, their eyes bulging as if frozen mid-scream. One of the boys gagged, covering his mouth as he stumbled back. Then they saw the calf. It was alive, if you could call it that. Its body was swollen, misshapen, with patches of fur peeled away to reveal raw, pulsing skin. It had no eyes, just smooth stretches of flesh where they should have been. When it turned toward them, it let out a sound that wasn't a moo or a cry. It was something human. A wordless, gurgling wail that sent the boys fleeing, their courage abandoned in the dirt. Henry didn't make it out. The others ran straight into town, babbling about what they'd seen, but when the sheriff arrived at the farm, there was no sign of the boy. Caleb greeted him on the porch, his face impassive as he denied knowing anything about a trespasser. "People shouldn't come round here uninvited," was all he said before closing the door. The sheriff didn't press further. He didn't want to. Weeks passed and Henry's parents put up missing posters, but everyone in town knew. Hollowfield had claimed him. Still, no one dared confront Caleb or the Drexlers. People avoided the farm, crossing the street if they so much as saw Caleb in town. Then the animals began showing up. Dead livestock from neighboring farms appeared on Hollowfield's property, mutilated in ways no one could explain. Horses gutted with surgical precision, sheep with their bones twisted into grotesque shapes. Each discovery was more horrifying than the last, yet no one dared accuse Caleb. Until Mrs. Carter went missing. She lived alone on the edge of town, close to the Drexler property. When her dog returned one morning, whining and covered in mud, neighbors went to check on her. They found her kitchen door open, her home empty. The only sign of her was a trail of footprints leading toward Hollowfield, disappearing at the edge of the woods. The town gathered at the church that night. Fear had festered into rage, and a group of men armed themselves with shotguns and torches. They marched to Hollowfield, determined to end whatever curse the farm carried. The Drexlers were waiting for them. The men didn't make it past the first field. By morning, the town awoke to find their corpses displayed along the fence line. Their bodies were twisted and contorted like the livestock, their faces frozen in expressions of unimaginable terror. That was the last straw. The sheriff declared Hollowfield off limits, though he didn't enforce it. No one needed convincing. The town simply moved on, pretending the farm didn't exist. But at night, the sounds carried on the wind, the cries of animals, or something trying to sound like them, and the low, guttural chants of voices that weren't quite human. Hollowfield still stands. No one goes near it, but the whispers never stopped. Some say Caleb still works the land, though others claim he's long gone, and what remains is something else entirely. On certain nights, when the moon is high and the air is still, you might see lights flickering in the barn, but no one goes to find out. The forest beyond the ridge was a place of caution and whispers, a dark expanse of ancient trees that clawed at the sky with gnarled fingers. Locals called it Blackroot Woods, named for the twisted roots that bulged like veins across the ground. It was the kind of place that swallowed sound, where even birds refused to sing, and shadows danced as if alive. People avoided it when they could, but sometimes curiosity killed caution. Rachel never believed the warnings. She had grown up hearing the stories, the cursed woods, the missing hunters, the hollow-eyed figures spotted between the trees. But she was a skeptic, and skeptics crave proof. When she inherited her grandfather's remote farmhouse on the edge of Blackroot, she saw it as an opportunity for quiet and cheap living. Her friends begged her to reconsider, but Rachel laughed off their concerns. The first few weeks were uneventful. The house was old and creaked in the wind, but it was peaceful. Rachel spent her days fixing up the property and her nights reading by the fireplace. Occasionally, she'd glance at the dark silhouette of the forest beyond her window, its edges blurred by mist. It seemed harmless enough. Then came the first night of scratching. It started faint, a soft scraping at the base of the house, like claws raking against the foundation. Rachel dismissed it as raccoons or stray cats and went back to sleep. But the next night, it was louder. The sound traveled, moving from one corner of the house to another, circling as if whatever was outside was searching for a way in. Rachel armed herself with a flashlight and a kitchen knife, stepping out into the chill of the night. The beam of light sliced through the fog, revealing nothing but the swaying grass and the distant tree line. The scratching stopped as soon as she emerged, the silence pressing against her like a weight. She waited, heart pounding, before retreating inside and locking every door and window. The following morning, she found deep gouges in the wood siding, long and deliberate, as though carved by massive claws. Her stomach twisted, but she told herself it was just animals. She bought traps and scattered them around the property, though something about the scratches made her uneasy. That night, the sounds returned, louder, closer. The traps were untouched, and the noise seemed to come from above now, scraping against the roof in long, deliberate strokes. Rachel stayed in bed, clutching the knife until dawn broke. It was the footprints that broke her resolve. She found them the next morning, leading from the woods to her house. They weren't animal prints. They were human. Bare feet, impossibly large, with toes too long and bent at unnatural angles. The steps circled her house before disappearing back into the forest. Rachel decided to leave. She packed a bag and called a friend, arranging to stay in town until she could figure out what was happening. But the car wouldn't start. No amount of coaxing could make the engine turn over. When she opened the hood, she found the wires shredded, as if something had chewed through them. Her phone had no signal, despite working fine the day before. By nightfall, Rachel was trapped. She barricaded herself in the living room, pushing furniture against the doors and windows. The scratching returned, more insistent this time, accompanied by a low, guttural moan that seemed to echo inside her skull. She thought she saw movement in the shadows outside, fleeting shapes darting between the trees. And then came the knocking. It was slow at first, a deliberate tap, tap, tap on the front door. Rachel froze, every muscle in her body screaming to stay silent. The knocking grew louder, more frantic, until it became a pounding that rattled the walls. "Let me in," and a voice rasped low and distorted. It sounded human, but wrong, like someone imitating speech. "It's cold out here." Rachel pressed herself against the wall, tears streaming down her face. She didn't answer. The pounding stopped, replaced by silence so thick it hummed in her ears. She held her breath, waiting, praying. Then came the whisper, inches from her ear. "You can't hide." Rachel screamed, scrambling to her feet. The barricade toppled as the front door burst open, set, but the space beyond was empty. The room grew colder, frost creeping along the windows. The whispers came from everywhere now, overlapping, unintelligible, growing louder and louder until they became a deafening roar. When the sun rose, the house was empty. Rachel was gone, her belongings scattered as though she'd left in a hurry. The locals found her car abandoned and the farmhouse doors swinging open, but there was no sign of her. The only clue was a single set of footprints, half impossibly large, leading from the woods to her bedroom window, and then back again. The old silo had been abandoned for decades, its rusting frame a skeletal beacon, at the edge of the field. Locals called it the Needle, though no one could explain why. It stood at the heart of an overgrown patch of farmland that no one dared claim, surrounded by gnarled weeds and a silence so oppressive it made the air feel thick. Stories about the Needle were the kind that parents told to scare children into obedience. Tales of disappearances, strange lights, and whispers carried on the wind. Nobody believed the stories until things started happening again. It was harvest season when the first boy vanished. Tommy Grayson was only 12, last seen riding his bike near the old Miller farm. His parents searched the woods and fields, their desperate cries echoing into the night. By morning, all they found was his bike, wheels spinning lazily in the dirt at the base of the silo. The sheriff wrote it off as a runaway, but the townsfolk weren't so sure. "It's the Needle," they murmured among themselves. "It's waking up." A week later, Mrs. Anders found her prize rooster torn apart, its entrails stretched across her porch in looping patterns. The same night, a strange humming noise was heard coming from the direction of the silo, a deep, resonant sound that made windows rattle and dogs howl. By the time the second boy, Lucas Myers, disappeared, fear gripped the town like a vice. Lucas had been playing hide-and-seek with friends near the edge of the Miller property when he vanished. His friends swore they saw him running toward the silo, though none of them dared follow. "It's calling them," old Mr. Hargrove said, his voice trembling as he clutched his hat. "The Needle's got a hunger, and it's calling for more." Despite the growing panic, no one dared go near the silo. Not until Claire. Claire was 17, fierce and stubborn as a mule. She didn't believe in ghost stories or curses, and she certainly didn't believe in the Needle. Lucas was her little brother, and if the town was too scared to find him, she'd do it herself. Armed with a flashlight and a baseball bat, she waited until midnight and made her way to the Miller farm. The fields were eerily quiet as she approached, the grass crunching under her boots. The silo loomed ahead, its jagged silhouette cutting into the moonlit sky. As she drew closer, the hum began, a low, vibrating note that seemed to come from the very earth beneath her feet. Her flashlight flickered as she stepped through the overgrown weeds. The air grew colder, and her breath came out in visible puffs. She reached the base of the silo, its rusted frame stretching impossibly high. Something about it felt wrong, as though the structure were alive, watching her. "Lucas," she called, her voice trembling despite herself. "Tommy!" The hum grew louder, almost deafening now, and the flashlight died completely. Claire cursed, slapping it against her palm when she noticed the glow. A faint, sickly green light pulsed from the cracks in the silo, spilling out like a heartbeat. She stepped back, clutching the bat tighter. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, and the hum shifted into something almost melodic, a haunting tune that burrowed into her mind. She felt it then, a pull, deep and primal, like invisible hands dragging her forward. "No," she muttered, fighting against the urge to move. "This isn't real." The green light flared brighter, and she saw them, faces pressed against the inside of the silo, pale and distorted, their mouths open in silent screams. She recognized Lucas immediately, his eyes wide with terror, his hands clawing at the surface as though trying to break free. "Lucas!" she screamed, rushing forward, but the air grew heavy, and her legs felt like they were moving through water. The hum turned into a deafening roar, and the light engulfed her. When Claire woke, she was lying in the middle of the field, the sun just beginning to rise. The silo was silent, its frame as lifeless as ever. Her bat was gone, and her hands were covered in strange black soot that wouldn't wash off. She stumbled back to town, her mind reeling. The sheriff found no sign of Lucas or Tommy, and Claire's story was dismissed as hysteria. But she knew what she saw, and she wasn't alone. Over the following weeks, more people began hearing the hum, seeing the light in the distance. And then the faces started appearing. Not inside the silo, but in the fields and windows of their homes. Pale, screaming faces watching from the darkness. By the end of the year, the town was empty, swallowed by the silence that surrounded the Needle. It still stands there, waiting. There was a house on a hill that everyone avoided, a looming Victorian relic known simply as the Wraith House. It had been abandoned for decades, its windows like empty eyes and its roof a jagged crown. No one in the town below could remember who built it or why it had been left to rot. But everyone knew the stories, of strange lights flickering inside, of figures seen moving in the windows at night, and of the scream that rang out every year on the anniversary of its most infamous tragedy. It was said that 30 years ago, a family of 4 moved into the house. The Greys. They were reclusive but polite, and for a time, nothing seemed amiss. Then came the night of the storm. Lightning cracked the sky, illuminating the house against the swirling dark. That was the night the screams began. Neighbors swore they heard the family crying for help, their voices shrill and desperate. But when morning came, the house was silent, and the Greys were gone. The only clue left behind was the dining room table, set for 5. No one ever claimed the property, but every year on the storm's anniversary, the scream would echo through the town, sending shivers down the spines of even the most skeptical. People boarded up their windows and stayed indoors, pretending not to hear it. This year, though, a group of college students decided to investigate. They were in town for a Halloween trip, staying at a nearby rental cabin, and when they heard the story of Wraith House, it became the centerpiece of their plans. Armed with flashlights, a camera, and a bottle of whiskey to steel their nerves, they made their way up the winding hill just as the storm began to brew. The air grew colder as they approached, the wind biting through their jackets. The house loomed above them, its silhouette illuminated by the occasional flicker of lightning. The front door was slightly ajar, swaying in the wind, as if inviting them in. Inside, the house smelled of mildew and rot. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs draped the corners like veils. The students fanned out, their laughter nervous as they explored. They found the dining room quickly, its table still set for 5. The plates were cracked and faded, but eerily clean, as though someone had been maintaining them. A single candle stood in the center of the table, unlit but pristine. "Creepy," muttered Lisa, the boldest of the group. She ran her fingers over the edge of the table. "Feels staged." "It's just a story," said Greg, her boyfriend. "Probably some urban legend to keep kids away." Their friend Sam, the quiet one, pointed at the candle. "Do you hear that?" he asked. Everyone stopped. At first, they heard nothing but the wind rattling the windows. Then, faintly, a sound, a low murmur, like voices whispering just out of earshot. It seemed to come from the walls, shifting and sliding. "Let's light it," Lisa said, pulling a lighter from her pocket. "Bad idea," Sam warned, but she had already struck the flame. The moment the candle's wick caught, the whispers stopped. The house fell unnaturally silent. Then came the first scream. It was a piercing, gut-wrenching wail, echoing through the house with impossible force. The students clapped their hands over their ears, stumbling back in terror. The candle's flame flared bright green, casting twisted shadows across the walls. Greg grabbed Lisa's arm. "We're leaving. Now." But as they turned toward the door, they saw it. A figure standing at the top of the staircase. Its body was shrouded in darkness, but its eyes glowed, pale and furious, like dying embers. Another scream tore through the air, this one closer, more visceral. The figure descended the stairs with jerky, unnatural movements. The students bolted, their screams joining the cacophony. They ran through the front door and into the storm, but the house wouldn't let them go so easily. The path twisted, leading them back toward the porch no matter which direction they ran. "Why can't we leave?" Lisa sobbed, her voice raw. Sam pointed back at the house, his face pale as death. "The windows." They turned and saw their reflections in the glass, distorted and wrong. The images stared back with empty, hollow eyes, grinning mouths stretched impossibly wide. "Set the table," whispered a voice, soft but commanding. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Finish what was started." Sam's flashlight flickered and died. Greg grabbed him, pulling him toward the woods, but as they ran, the ground shifted beneath their feet, softening into something wet and sticky. The air grew heavy with the stench of decay, and the storm seemed to howl with laughter. Only Lisa made it out. She stumbled into town at dawn, her clothes torn and her eyes vacant. She babbled about shadows and screams, about a table waiting to be completed. When the townsfolk climbed the hill to investigate, they found the house just as it had always been, silent and empty. But the dining room table was different. It was set for 8. The rain was relentless, hammering the ground in sheets as Sarah gripped the steering wheel of her car. She was miles from the nearest town, driving down an unmarked road through a maze of empty fields. Her GPS had stopped working hours ago, leaving her with only the faint glow of her headlights and the occasional flash of lightning to guide her. She cursed herself for taking the back roads, but it was supposed to save time. Then she saw it, a figure standing in the middle of the road. Sarah slammed on the brakes, her heart leaping into her throat. The car skidded to a halt, just feet away from the person. She blinked against the rain-smeared windshield, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. It was a man, tall and thin, with his head tilted unnaturally to one side. He wore a tattered coat and had no shoes, his bare feet planted firmly in the mud. Sarah rolled down her window just enough to call out, "Hey, are you okay?" The man didn't answer. He didn't move. His face was obscured by the shadows, but she could feel his gaze on her, heavy and invasive. A chill crawled up her spine. "I'll call for help," she shouted, fumbling for her phone, but of course there was no signal. The man raised one hand, pointing to the field beside her. Slowly, unnervingly, he began walking into the darkness. His movements jerky and unsteady, as sounded like a puppet on tangled strings. "Wait," Sarah called, stepping out of the car despite every instinct screaming at her to stay put. The rain soaked her instantly, plastering her hair to her face. She followed the man with her flashlight, the beam cutting through the downpour. He was leading her to something. The field was wild and overgrown, the tall grass whipping against her legs as she walked. Lightning flashed, illuminating a structure in the distance. It was a barn, sagging and ancient, its paint long stripped away by time. The man reached the barn door and stopped, his hand resting on the rotted wood. Sarah hesitated. "What's in there?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The darkness swallowed him. Against her better judgment, Sarah followed. The barn was colder than it had any right to be, the air damp and heavy with the smell of mildew and something metallic. Her flashlight flickered as she scanned the interior. The space was empty except for the remnants of broken stalls and a ladder leading to the loft. Then she saw it, a trail of muddy footprints leading to the center of the barn. At the end of the trail was a large, circular stain on the floor, dark and glistening. She crouched down, running her fingers over the edge. It was sticky. Blood. A sharp noise from above made her jerk upright. It was a creak, like a footstep on wood. She aimed her flashlight at the loft, the beam trembling in her hands. "Hello?" she called, her voice thin. The only response was the sound of something shifting, dragging across the floorboards. She climbed the ladder slowly, each rung groaning under her weight. Her flashlight revealed more blood, streaked along the walls like something had been dragged through the space. And then she saw him. The man was standing in the corner of the loft, his back to her, his head still tilted at that unnatural angle. His body swayed slightly, as though caught in an invisible breeze. "Sir?" Sarah whispered, inching closer. She could hear her own breathing, sharp and ragged, over the pounding rain. The man turned. His face was wrong. His eyes were black pits, and his mouth hung open in a frozen scream, stretching far wider than it should have. His skin was gray and cracked, as if it had been left out in the sun too long. Sarah stumbled back, the flashlight tumbling from her hand and clattering to the floor below. The darkness surged around her, and she felt it, something cold and wet wrapping around her ankle. She screamed, kicking wildly, but the grip was unyielding. The last thing she saw before she was pulled into the shadows was the man's face splitting into a wide, inhuman grin. When Sarah's car was found days later, abandoned on the road, there was no sign of her. The barn, when searched, was empty except for a strange, circular stain on the floor and muddy footprints leading out into the field. The locals know better than to drive those roads during the rain. They say the man is still out there, waiting in the storm, leading the lost into the dark. The sun had long since set when Mark and Claire finally arrived at the little cabin in the woods. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway. No phones, no work, just them and the solitude of nature. The rental was cheap, and the host had warned them it was remote with no cell service and spotty electricity, but they didn't mind. That was part of the charm. The cabin itself was small but cozy, with a stone fireplace and walls lined with faded books. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp earth. A single oil lamp flickered on the dining table, left burning by the host, along with a handwritten note. "Stay inside after dark. Don't open the door for anyone." Claire chuckled nervously, reading the message. "Well, that's not ominous. Probably just to scare tourists," Mark said, tossing their bags onto the couch. "You know, local flavor." Still, they double-checked the locks before settling in for the night. The first knock came just after midnight. It was soft, almost hesitant, as if whoever was outside didn't want to disturb them too much. Mark and Claire froze, exchanging wide-eyed glances. They hadn't seen another car for miles on their way in. Who could possibly be out here? Maybe it's the host, Claire whispered. Mark shook his head. At this hour? The knock came again, louder this time. Hello, a voice called from outside, muffled by the door. It was a man's voice, low and raspy. Is anyone in there? I need help. Claire moved toward the door, but Mark grabbed her arm. Wait, what if it's, I don't know, a scam or something? In the middle of nowhere? Claire frowned. What if he's hurt? The voice called out again, more desperate this time. Please, I'm lost. I won't hurt you. Claire hesitated, then walked toward the door despite Mark's protests. She peered through the peephole, but saw nothing, just the faint outline of the porch, illuminated by the moonlight. Where are you? She called. The voice answered, closer now. Right here. Claire's blood ran cold. The voice was far too close, yet the porch was empty. She stepped back from the door, her pulse quickening. Don't open it, Mark hissed, pulling her away. The note, remember the note? The knocking returned, harder this time, rattling the door on its hinges. Let me in, the voice demanded, its tone shifting. It no longer sounded pleading, it sounded angry. Mark grabbed a poker from the fireplace, clutching it tightly as the knocking grew more violent. Whoever you are, go away, he shouted. Silence. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackling of the fire. Claire exhaled, her hands trembling. Maybe it left. Mark wasn't convinced, but he nodded. Let's just wait until morning. But then came the scratching. It was faint at first, like nails running along the outside of the cabin. It moved along the walls, circling the house. Claire pressed her hands over her ears, trying to block it out, but the sound grew louder, sharper, as if whatever was outside was trying to claw its way in. Stay away, Mark yelled, brandishing the poker. His voice cracked with fear. The scratching stopped, and then, from outside the window, let me in, Mark. Mark froze, his name hanging in the air like a threat. The voice was wrong now, distorted and gravely, as though several voices were speaking at once. How does it know your name? Claire whispered, her face pale. The window rattled as something heavy slammed against it. They couldn't see anything through the glass, just darkness and the reflection of their terrified faces. The voice spoke again, softer this time, almost sing-song. I know you're scared. You should be. The oil lamp flickered violently before going out, plunging the room into darkness. Claire fumbled for her phone, but there was no signal, just the useless glow of the screen. The fire in the hearth dimmed to embers, leaving them in near total blackness. The cabin creaked as if under great weight, and then the voice was inside. You should have opened the door. Claire screamed, spinning toward the sound, but the room was empty. Mark swung the poker wildly, hitting nothing but air. The voice laughed, echoing from every corner. The front door burst open, the wind howling into the room and extinguishing the last of the fire. In the darkness, Claire and Mark saw it, a figure, impossibly tall, its limbs too long and its face a shifting void of shadow. It stepped forward, its head tilting in mock curiosity, and then everything went black. The next morning, the cabin was quiet. The door stood open, swinging gently in the breeze. The dining table still held the oil lamp, now cold and unlit, and the host's note remained untouched. Of Mark and Claire there was no trace except for the scratches on the inside of the door, and 2 sets of footprints leading away from the cabin, deep into the woods, where the trees swallowed them whole. The small fishing town of Greystone had always been shrouded in fog, its weathered docks creaking under the weight of time and secrets. Perched on a jagged cliff overlooking the sea was an ancient lighthouse, its beam long extinguished. The locals called it the Widow's Lantern, though no one could agree on why. Some said it was named after a tragic accident at sea. Others whispered about disappearances, people lured to the lighthouse by unseen forces, never to return. Hannah didn't believe in ghost stories. A journalist from the city, she had come to Greystone chasing a different kind of tale, rumors of illegal fishing operations and smuggling along the coastline. The lighthouse, though eerie, was just a backdrop to her real investigation. Her first night in town, Hannah struck up a conversation with Tom, the grizzled owner of the local pub. He warned her, like everyone else, to stay away from the lighthouse. Nothing good's ever come out of that place, Tom said, his voice low. People go up there thinking they'll find answers, but all they find is the sea calling them home. Hannah dismissed his words as superstition, but something in his tone unsettled her. That night, as she lay in her bed at the inn, the fog rolled in thicker than ever, swallowing the moonlight. She stared out her window, her mind replaying Tom's words. Then she saw it, a faint, flickering light at the top of the lighthouse. Impossible. She'd been told the lantern hadn't worked in decades. Curiosity overrode her better judgment. Grabbing her camera and a flashlight, she set out toward the cliffs. The town was silent, the streets empty save for the sound of her boots on the cobblestones. The lighthouse loomed ahead, its black silhouette piercing the mist. The climb up the narrow, winding path was treacherous. The closer she got, the louder the waves crashed against the rocks below, as if the ocean itself were warning her to turn back. But the light continued to flicker, guiding her like a beacon. When she reached the lighthouse, the door creaked open as if waiting for her. The air inside was damp and stale, carrying the scent of salt and decay. Her flashlight illuminated a spiral staircase, its rusted metal steps leading into darkness. "Hannah," a voice whispered, barely audible over the sound of the waves. She froze. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but unmistakable. It was her name. She swept her flashlight around, but the room was empty. "Hannah." The voice came again, echoing from above. Heart pounding, she climbed the stairs, each step groaning under her weight. The higher she went, the colder the air grew until her breath came out in visible puffs. The light from the lantern flickered brighter, casting shifting shadows that seemed to writhe along the walls. When she reached the top, she found the lantern room deserted. The great glass lens was cracked, its machinery rusted and inert. Yet the light burned, a cold, unnatural glow. She raised her camera to take a picture, but as the flash went off, the lantern extinguished, plunging the room into darkness. And then she felt it, hands cold and clammy gripping her shoulders. She spun around, her flashlight trembling in her grasp. The room was empty, but the air felt heavy, oppressive, as if something unseen were watching her. The walls groaned, and the whispers began again, louder now, overlapping and frantic. "Hannah, join us." The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a chorus, rising and falling like the tide. Shadows moved in the corners of her vision, growing darker, thicker, until they formed shapes, figures with hollow eyes and gaping mouths. They reached for her, their fingers like tendrils of smoke. Panicked, she bolted down the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the confined space. The voices followed, growing louder, more insistent. "Don't leave, Hannah. It's so peaceful here." She burst through the door into the foggy night, the wind whipping at her hair. The whispers didn't stop. They surrounded her, carried by the mist, calling her name over and over. Hannah ran blindly down the path, slipping on the slick rocks. The edge of the cliff loomed ahead, but the fog was too thick to see clearly. The voices grew louder, more urgent. She stopped, disoriented, her heart pounding. Then she saw them. Figures in the fog, their outlines faint but unmistakable. They stood at the edge of the cliff, staring at her with those hollow eyes. One of them stepped forward, and in the dim light she recognized the face. It was Tom, the bartender. But that was impossible. She'd seen him hours ago, alive and well. "Come back," he said, his voice distant and hollow. "You're almost home." Hannah screamed and stumbled backward, losing her footing. Her camera slipped from her grasp, tumbling into the void. She turned and ran, not stopping until she reached the safety of the town. The next morning, Hannah tried to tell the townsfolk what she'd seen, but they only shook their heads. "The widow's lantern," they said. "It chooses who it calls." Later, when she returned to the pub to confront Tom, she found it closed. A photograph on the wall caught her eye. It was an old black and white picture of a younger Tom, standing with a group of men in front of the lighthouse. The caption read, "Lost at Sea, 1984. That was the last night Hannah stayed in Greystone. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when the fog rolls in, she swears she hears her name whispered on the wind, calling her back to the widow's lantern. The night the storm rolled in, David was alone in his family's farmhouse. The sprawling property had been in his family for generations, a secluded piece of land surrounded by dense woods and miles of empty fields. He wasn't supposed to be there alone. His parents were out of town for the weekend, and his younger sister was staying with a friend. But David, 17 and eager to prove he didn't need company, had insisted he could handle it. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as rain lashed against the house. David sat on the couch, the glow of the TV the only light in the room. He was halfway through a horror movie when the power went out, plunging the house into darkness. "Great," he muttered, reaching for his phone. Its flashlight was weak, but better than nothing. He grabbed a lantern from the kitchen, lighting it with a shaky hand. Shadows danced across the walls, stretching and twisting with the flicker of the flame. That's when he heard the first knock. It was faint, barely audible over the storm, but distinct enough to make him freeze. It came again, 3 soft knocks on the front door. David frowned. Who could be out here in this weather? He hesitated before approaching the door, the lantern casting eerie shapes on the walls. "Hello?" he called, his voice wavering. No answer. The wind screamed outside, and for a moment David convinced himself it had just been a branch hitting the door. But as he turned away, the knocking resumed. Louder this time, more insistent. His stomach knotted. Against his better judgment, he opened the door. No one was there. The porch was empty, the rain pounding against the wooden boards. Beyond it, the yard was swallowed by darkness, the trees swaying violently in the storm. David stepped outside, peering into the night. "Hello?" he called again. A flash of lightning illuminated the yard for a split second, and he saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the field, just where the grass met the woods. It was tall and thin, its face obscured by the rain and shadows. "Hey!" David shouted, his voice rising with panic. But the figure didn't move, it just stood there, watching. He stepped back into the house, slamming the door shut and locking it. His heart raced as he fumbled for his phone, but there was no signal. He thought about calling his neighbors, but they lived miles away, and the storm made it impossible to drive. The knocking came again, this time from the back door. David's blood ran cold. There was no way anyone could have circled the house that quickly. His breathing quickened as he moved toward the kitchen, the lantern shaking in his hand. The back door rattled under the force of the knocks, the sound reverberating through the house. He crept closer, his pulse pounding in his ears. The knocking stopped, replaced by a new sound, scratching, long, deliberate scratches like nails dragging across the wood. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice cracking. The scratching stopped. Then came a voice, soft and rasping. "Let me in." David backed away, the lantern casting frantic shadows. "Go away," he shouted. The voice came again, closer this time. "David, let me in," his name. Whoever, or whatever, it was knew his name. Terrified, he bolted up the stairs to his room, locking the door behind him. He sat on his bed, clutching the lantern, his eyes fixed on the door. The house was silent except for the storm raging outside. Then the footsteps started. They were slow and deliberate, creaking on the wooden stairs. David's stomach churned as they reached the hallway, stopping just outside his room. He held his breath, straining to hear. The doorknob rattled. "David," the voice whispered from the other side. "Don't you recognize me?" He shook his head, tears streaming down his face. "Go away," the voice laughed, low and guttural. The doorknob stopped rattling, and for a moment everything was quiet. David hoped it was over. Then something heavy slammed against the door, making it shudder in its frame. David screamed, backing into the corner of the room. The door groaned as the pounding continued, the wood splintering under the force. With a final, deafening crack, the door burst open. But there was nothing there. The hallway beyond was empty. David's lantern flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. He fumbled with his phone, using its dim light to scan the room. The shadows seemed alive, shifting and stretching unnaturally. Then he saw it in the corner. A shape, hunched and wrong, its limbs too long and its face shrouded in darkness. It crawled toward him, its movements jerky and inhuman. "David," it rasped, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. "You should have let me in," he screamed as it lunged, its shadow engulfing him. When the storm cleared the next morning, the neighbors found the farmhouse eerily quiet. The front and back doors were wide open, but there was no sign of David. In his room, the lantern lay shattered on the floor, and the walls were scratched with deep claw-like marks. The only clue was a single muddy footprint leading from the hallway to his bed, and stopping at the edge. No one stayed in the farmhouse after that. It was left to rot, overtaken by the woods. But locals say that on stormy nights you can still hear the knocking, 3 soft raps on the door, followed by a voice calling from the dark. "Let me in." The cornfields surrounding the small town of Hollow Bend stretched for miles, their stalks towering and thick, creating a labyrinth of rustling whispers when the wind passed through. The fields had always been a source of unease for the locals, especially after dark. Strange things happened there, things people didn't talk about. Maggie had heard the stories her entire life. Missing pets, shadowy figures seen at the edges of the fields, and the most persistent tale of all, the Corn Witch. They said she was a farmer's wife long ago who had been accused of witchcraft and burned alive in her own fields. Her dying curse was that the land would forever belong to her. She was said to roam the rows, searching for trespassers to claim for her own. But Maggie didn't believe in ghost stories. At 16, she rolled her eyes at every mention of the Corn Witch. So when her friends dared her to spend a night in the cornfields, she didn't hesitate. "Piece of cake," Maggie said with a smirk, grabbing a flashlight and her dad's old camping gear. "You'll chicken out before midnight," scoffed her best friend, Leah. "We'll see," Maggie replied, determined to prove them wrong. The night was quiet when Maggie arrived at the edge of the fields. The air was thick with the scent of soil and damp leaves. She set up her small tent just a few rows in, making sure the towering stalks would block any light from the road. The wind was still, but the rustling of the corn continued, as if something unseen was moving through it. Maggie shook off a shiver and settled into her tent, her flashlight casting a soft glow. She texted her friends a smug message: "Still here. Not scared." Hours passed. The flashlight's beam grew dimmer, and the sounds of the night seemed to grow louder. Crickets chirped, an owl hooted in the distance, and every so often there was the faint rustle of corn. Around midnight, Maggie heard it, a soft, deliberate whisper. At first, she thought it was the wind, but it came again, clearer this time. Maggie, her heart skipped a beat. She sat up, clutching the flashlight. "Leah, is that you? This isn't funny." No answer. The whisper came again, this time from the other side of the tent. "Maggie." The voice was thin and high-pitched, almost like a child's. Maggie's pulse quickened. "Who's there?" she demanded, trying to sound braver than she felt. The corn rustled violently as though something large was moving through it. Maggie unzipped the tent and shone her flashlight outside, sweeping it across the rows. Nothing. The stalks stood tall and unbroken, their leaves swaying gently. Then she heard it again. Closer now. "Maggie." She spun around, and for a split second, her flashlight caught something. A face, pale and gaunt, peering at her from between the stalks. Its eyes were black, its mouth twisted into a cruel smile. Maggie screamed, stumbling backward. The flashlight slipped from her hands and went out, plunging her into darkness. She scrambled for her phone, her fingers trembling, but the screen was dead. The whispers multiplied, surrounding her. "Maggie! Maggie! Maggie!" Panicking, she ran, crashing through the corn rows. The stalks seemed endless, with their leaves slapping against her face and arms. The whispers grew louder, turning into laughter, high, shrill, and inhuman. She didn't know how long she ran before she stumbled into a clearing. In the center stood a scarecrow, its tattered clothes flapping in the breeze. But something was wrong. The scarecrow's head wasn't a sack of straw. It was a skull, its hollow eyes staring at her. At its feet lay fresh bones, scattered in the dirt. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. Maggie froze, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Then she felt it, a hand, cold and clawed, gripping her shoulder. She turned, and there she was, the Corn Witch. Her face was ashen and hollow, her eyes glowing with a sickly yellow light. Her smile stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "You came to my field," the witch hissed, her voice like rustling leaves. "Now you'll stay." Maggie screamed as the witch's hand tightened, her nails digging into flesh. The cornfield erupted in movement, the stalks bending and twisting as if alive, reaching for Maggie, pulling her down. The last thing she saw was the witch's grin, growing wider and wider as the darkness consumed her. When Maggie's friends came looking for her the next morning, they found her tent torn to shreds. Her phone lay on the ground, the screen cracked. In the dirt near the scarecrow, they found a single footprint, a barefoot imprint larger than any human's. They never spoke of what they saw, but every year after that, when the corn was high and the wind carried strange whispers, they avoided the fields at all costs. Some say Maggie's spirit joined the Corn Witch, her laughter mingling with the rustle of the leaves, calling to anyone foolish enough to step into the rows after dark. In the heart of the Appalachian Mountains lay the forgotten mining town of Black Hollow, Black Hollow. Once bustling with miners and their families, the town had been abandoned after a cave-in trapped dozens of men deep within the mine. The incident was declared unspeakable tragedy, and no recovery effort had ever been attempted. Over the years, Black Hollow gained a reputation for being cursed. Locals swore the mine was haunted and warned anyone curious enough to approach it to stay far away. Leah and her 3 friends, Adam, Nate, and Carla, didn't believe in curses. They were urban explorers, always on the lookout for abandoned places to explore. When they heard about Black Hollow, they couldn't resist. The idea of exploring an old mining town, untouched for decades, was too exciting to pass up. They arrived at dusk, parking their truck just outside the town limits. The buildings were skeletal remains, their wooden frames warped and weathered by time. The air was eerily still, and the fading sunlight painted the town in long shadows. "This place is creepy," Carla muttered, pulling her jacket tighter. "Exactly why we're here," Nate grinned, snapping a picture with his camera. The group made their way through the ruins, documenting their exploration. Despite their excitement, Leah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She chalked it up to nerves and pressed on. Eventually, they reached the entrance to the mine. The gaping black hole in the earth seemed to breathe, the air emanating from it damp and cool. A rusted sign hung above the entrance, its letters barely legible: "Black Hollow Mine, no trespassing." "Come on," Adam said, switching on his flashlight. "This is the main event." Leah hesitated. "Maybe we shouldn't. People died in there." "That was decades ago," Adam said dismissively. "It's just a hole in the ground now." The others nodded, their curiosity outweighing their unease. Reluctantly, Leah followed them into the mine. The tunnel was narrow and damp, the walls slick with moisture. Their flashlights illuminated rusted tracks, abandoned tools, and occasional wooden beams, their supports warped and unstable. The deeper they went, the quieter it became, the only sounds their footsteps and the distant drip of water. About 100 yards in, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. Old mining carts and equipment lay scattered, covered in decades of dust. But what caught their attention was the writing scrawled across the walls in faded red paint. "Leave them be." "Creepy," Nate whispered, snapping another picture. "Probably someone trying to scare off trespassers," Adam said, though his voice lacked conviction. As they explored the chamber, a faint noise echoed through the tunnel, a low, guttural moan. "Did you hear that?" Carla asked, her voice trembling. "It's just the wind," Adam said quickly. Leah wasn't so sure. The sound had been too deliberate, too human. They pressed on, venturing deeper into the mine. The air grew colder, and the sense of unease in Leah's chest tightened. That's when they found the elevator shaft. The rusted metal cage hung precariously over a black abyss. Beside it was a pulley system, its gears long seized with rust. "Bet the collapse happened down there," Adam shining his flashlight into the void. As if on cue, the moaning sound returned, louder this time. It echoed up the shaft, filling the chamber with its eerie resonance. "Okay, I'm done," Leah said, backing away. "We shouldn't be here." "Relax," Adam said. "It's just..." Before he could finish, the ground beneath them trembled. Dust and pebbles fell from the ceiling as the sound of groaning metal filled the air. Then, from the darkness of the shaft, something moved. It was subtle at first, a faint shuffling. But as they stood frozen, it grew louder, closer. "Is someone down there?" Carla whispered. The answer came in the form of a hand. Pale and skeletal, it gripped the edge of the elevator shaft, followed by another. Slowly, a figure emerged. It wasn't human, not anymore. Its skin was ashen, stretched taut over jagged bones. Its eyes were empty sockets, but they seemed to see, locking onto the group with unrelenting focus. Its jaw hung slack, revealing broken, blackened teeth. And it wasn't alone. Dozens of them clawed their way out of the shaft, their movements jerky and unnatural. They wore the remnants of mining uniforms, their name patches faded and torn. Their moans filled the chamber, a haunting symphony of despair. "Run!" Leah screamed. The group bolted, their flashlights bobbing wildly as they sprinted back through the tunnels. Behind them, the creatures gave chase, their movements faster than they had any right to be. Leah's heart pounded as they reached the entrance. She risked a glance back and saw the creatures crawling along the walls and ceiling, their hollow eyes fixed on her. The group burst into the open air, but the creatures didn't stop. They poured out of the mine like a flood, their moans rising into a deafening wail. "Get to the truck!" Adam shouted. They scrambled inside, slamming the doors just as the first of the creatures reached them. Bony hands clawed at the windows, smearing them with grime and blood. Adam floored the gas, and the truck roared to life, speeding down the dirt road. The creatures didn't follow far, stopping at the edge of the town. As the truck disappeared into the distance, they stood motionless, their heads tilted as if listening. Then, one by one, they turned and shuffled back into the mine. The group never spoke of what happened that night, but none of them ever returned to Black Hollow. The mine remained silent, its entrance yawning like a hungry mouth. But locals say that on quiet nights, if you listen closely, you can hear the moans of the miners, still searching for a way out.